In a quiet corner of the 11th arrondissement of Paris, nestled between a boulangerie and a printing shop, sat a narrow building with fogged-up windows and a smell of varnish. It was not remarkable from the outside. In fact, you might easily mistake it for a storeroom or a disused tailor's shop. But inside, by 5:45 in the morning, gas lamps flickered to life, illuminating rolls of silk, stacks of ribs, brass ferrules, and the faint, ever-present scent of damp fabric and glue. This was the atelier of Monsieur Jules Lefebvre, umbrella manufacturer. Jules was not famous. He did not invent a new mechanism, nor was he the subject of any significant labor dispute. But his shop operated continuously from 1882 to 1904, producing roughly 12 umbrellas a day by hand. The Lefebvre workshop is one of many forgotten gears in the great machine of Parisian industry at the end of the 19th century. And like many such gears, it turned with precision, repetition, and the quiet diligence of workers whose names never made the pages of history books. The first to arrive each morning was old Marinette, a former seamstress who lost her eyesight in one eye. Her job was to inspect the silk that had been dyed the previous day. She would run her fingers over the cloth to feel for inconsistencies in the weave, a tactile quality assurance long before electric looms and synthetic fibers. Black and dark navy were the preferred colors. Browns were fashionable, but often harder to match with brass handles. By 6:30, the journeymen were arriving. Etienne, who specialized in rib alignment, and little Pascal, who just completed his apprenticeship. They wore brown cotton smocks and thick woolen socks to keep out the morning chill. Jules, by contrast, wore a waistcoat and a short cravat. He rarely did physical labor anymore, preferring to handle inventory, invoices, and occasional sales from the front desk. Materials of the trade. Umbrellas at this time were complex objects. The canopy was usually silk, tightly woven and imported from Lyon. The ribs, those delicate yet resilient spines, were made from whale baleen, steel, or occasionally cane. Baleen was already expensive by 1890, and steel ribs were becoming the standard. Jules preferred spring steel from Sheffield, imported irregularly by river and rail. The handles were more ornate. Some were shaped from horn or polished wood, others bore silver tips, even ivory on occasion. But in the Lefebvre shop, simplicity was the rule. Most handles were made of varnished chestnut or ash, bent into a hook using steam from a small copper kettle that hissed all day in the back room. Each umbrella was assembled by hand in 5 stages. Rib cutting and frame construction. Handle shaping and attachment. Canopy cutting, sewing and attachment. Folding and testing, the open-close mechanism. Final varnishing and quality inspection. It was not glamorous. It was not artistic in the way hat-making or shoemaking could be, but it was essential. Paris, after all, rained more often than it snowed. Daily rhythms. By midday, the workshop would hum with a quiet energy. There was little talking. The rhythmic clicking of hand-cranked sewing machines echoed against the stone walls. Occasionally, Etienne would mutter about a warped rib or a dull blade. Lunch was taken on benches at the rear, bread with sardines, perhaps a soft cheese, tea or chicory coffee from a dented tin pot. The apprentices were forbidden from using the frame press, which required careful balance and pressure. Pascal once tried it when Jules stepped out to speak with a client. The resulting frame bent too far and snapped, sending shards of brass skittering across the floor. He spent 2 weeks filing handles as punishment. The back room was reserved for drying and varnishing. Umbrellas were hung like bats from a rack above a small stove. A special mixture of beeswax and linseed oil was used on wooden handles. The smell lingered on one's clothes for days. It was said you could tell an umbrella worker from the scent varnish and wet silk. Customers and orders. Customers rarely came in person. Most orders came from local boutiques or department stores such as Le Bon Marché or La Samaritaine. Lefebvre's umbrellas were mid-tier, not as elegant as those made in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, but far more dependable. Each shipment was wrapped in wax paper, tied with twine, and stamped with a red insignia featuring a small, dignified parasol. Larger orders came during spring and fall, aligning with the Parisian rainy seasons. In summer, demand dropped, and workers sometimes picked up odd jobs elsewhere, helping at vineyards, repairing furniture, or working for tanners. But the core team, the six who had been with Jules for years, stayed loyal. And Jules rewarded them with predictability. Pay every Thursday, wine on Bastille Day, and 1 week off in August, unheard of for many other workshops of the era. Tools and ingenuity. There were no patents in this room. Innovation was not the goal, survival was. Yet within this apparent monotony lay subtle genius. A new way to fold the fabric with less bunching. A better way to anchor the rib tips to the canopy. Jules once modified an old shoemaker's awl into a tool for puncturing the brass sockets with greater precision. Pascal, impressed, asked if that was how engineers worked. Jules had simply replied, "No, that's how poor men solve problems." The ingenuity was not in new technology, but in adapting old tools to new problems. Paris beyond the windows. Outside the window, life in Paris went on. The clatter of horse carts, the sound of bells from Notre Dame in the distance, and the distant echo of hawkers near Place de la Bastille. The Eiffel Tower was only a year old. To the workers, it was a distant curiosity, not part of their world. Their world was glue pots, cold mornings, sore fingers, and the satisfaction of a canopy folding without resistance. And yet that satisfaction was hard-earned. A good umbrella was like a secret only noticed when it failed. A quiet profession in a noisy age. By 1890, the world was changing rapidly. Electricity, telephones, even early automobiles began disrupting the urban soundscape. But in this workshop, time seemed to hold its breath. Day after day, year after year, the same motions, same tools, same cautious attention to detail. And in that there was a peculiar kind of peace, predictability, even serenity. But one has to wonder, how long could such a workshop survive in a city and century moving so quickly toward mechanization and mass production? The smell of the workshop changed with the seasons. In the summer months, it was musty silk and dry dust. In the winter, you could smell wool coats damp from rain hanging near the door. But in the fall, when orders surged and the pace quickened, it smelled of leather palms, sweat, and warm glue. This was when the real work began. By mid-September, Paris became a city of umbrellas again. Women in long skirts swayed beneath canopies like floating mushrooms. Gentlemen tapped their walking sticks while their umbrellas hung from their forearms, a sign of both preparedness and pride. There were umbrella etiquette rules, especially for the bourgeoisie. Carrying it tightly closed was a mark of quality. A badly furled umbrella was a sign of cheapness. And so, back in the Lefebvre workshop, the pressure to produce perfect umbrellas mounted with the falling leaves. The people behind the product. Let us return to the workers. In the grand narratives of French industrial labor, they are nearly invisible because they were not radicals, not poets, not inventors. But here, in this narrow space lit by flickering lamps, they formed a micro-society of mutual reliance. There was Marion, a widow of 43, who stitched the canopies. She had learned her trade from a cousin who worked in a glove factory. Her fingers, stained with thread dye, moved with swift grace. She always hummed while she worked hymns mostly, or half-remembered songs from her childhood in the Jura Mountains. Etienne, who managed rib alignment, had once dreamed of becoming a carpenter like his father. But asthma made sawdust unbearable, and so he had taken to steel instead. He could look at a rib joint and detect a half-millimeter misalignment with his naked eye. Pascal, the youngest, had grown since Section 1. Now 16, he was allowed to work the frame press under supervision. He still wore the same smock, though it hung a bit shorter on him. He was good at folding, an underrated skill. Folding the umbrella properly not only prevented wrinkles in the silk, but also showed clients that it had been made with pride. And then there was Jules Lefebvre, the patriarch of this small enterprise. Every day he wrote notes in a thick ledger, ordered dates, material costs, hours worked. The ink was always black, never blue. Blue was for schoolteachers, he said. Black ink lasted longer. He had a drawer with old invoices, written in francs and centimes, from customers long dead or retired. Some had ordered umbrellas with initials sewn into the silk. Others wanted heavier canopies for wind. One request, long ago, had come from a woman who claimed she needed a silent opening umbrella so as not to disturb her cat. Lefebvre made it. The spring was wrapped in oilcloth. It worked. The customer never returned. Tools, tedium, and tactile memory. To truly understand this world, you must picture the tools. The iron frame press sat on a bench in the corner, blackened with age. Beside it, a long wooden table with spools of thread charcoal, ash gray, midnight blue. Near the window, a cutting board permanently scored from decades of trimming silk panels into wedge shapes. Each worker had their own pincushion, a personal artifact. Some were shaped like birds or turtles, others were just clumps of cloth. They were handed down like family relics. There was no clock. Time was kept by instinct and habit. A second kettle of water meant it was 11. The turning light on the cobblestones outside meant it was almost evening. The silence after varnishing meant that it was time to go home. But the tedium of the work bred a strange intimacy. A seam sewn wrong by Marion would be felt in the canopy by Pascal. A rib too tight from Etienne could snap under Jules' test bend. Every movement affected another. The product was communal even though it bore no names. It was a delicate balance between precision and rhythm, a tactile memory passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Jules often said, "The hands remember what the eyes forget." The slow rise of mechanization. By 1894, murmurs of change had begun to seep into the quiet world of umbrella making. A new factory opened on the outskirts of Paris, boasting mechanized canopy cutters and imported frame assemblies from Belgium. Their umbrellas sold for a third of the price. They looked the same at a glance, but in Jules' words, they fold like bread left in the rain. There was a fear in the workshop, though no one named it. If clients stopped requesting Lefebvre umbrellas, what would happen? None of the workers were trained for other trades, and the city was changing quickly. Horse-drawn delivery carts now shared roads with early petrol carriages. Electricity buzzed on corner lamps. Advertisements for automatic clothes wringers and pre-stitched garments plastered brick walls. Pascal asked Jules one day, "Will they ever make machines that stitch the ribs?" Jules didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said, "Machines don't know when a rib is lying to you." Still, the orders from boutiques continued for now. Quality still held a place in some corners of Parisian taste, but the future loomed, not loudly but steadily, like rain on a cafe awning. Human cost, hidden labor. Despite their calm demeanor, the lives of these workers were not easy. Marion walked home 4 kilometers each night to a boarding house she shared with 2 other women. She had no children. Her husband had died in the Franco-Prussian War, and they had never had time. She sent money to her younger sister in Lyon, who raised goats. Etienne's hands were permanently discolored by years of handling metal and polish. In winter, he soaked them in hot vinegar to keep them from cracking. He never married. Said he didn't want to bring children into a world where they'd have to worry about the price of coal every week. Pascal dreamed of owning a bicycle. He had seen one in a shop window on Rue de Charonne. It cost more than a month's wages. And Jules, he carried an ache in his hip, a limp from falling off a ladder back in '85. He never talked about it, but on damp days he winced when sitting too long. His wife had died of consumption in '89. He kept her locket behind the ink bottle. They were not tragic lives, nor were they triumphant. They were the lives of people who made things that protected other people from the rain. a day the rain wouldn't stop. One October afternoon in 1896, it rained so hard that even the gutters overflowed. Orders surged. Le Bon Marché sent for an urgent delivery. 40 umbrellas, all black, no adornments. The workshop buzzed. Jules called in an extra hand, a cousin who used to work in buttons. Marion stitched faster than usual. Etienne cut ribs until his fingers blistered. Pascal skipped lunch to varnish 6 handles by himself. When the shipment left in a horse-drawn cart just before dusk, everyone was soaked, tired, and silent. But Jules uncorked a bottle of wine and passed it around. A moment of stillness amid the rush. It rained for 6 hours, Pascal would say years later, but we stayed dry inside. The unseen ripple. What's fascinating about a place like the Lefevre umbrella shop is that it left no grand mark on history. It didn't change fashion. It wasn't written about in journals. But its umbrellas passed through the hands of thousands of Parisian schoolteachers, grocers, dressmakers. A Lefevre umbrella might have stood between a mother and a storm on the way to market, or shielded a young man waiting for a tram. Each object carried part of the workshop's rhythm into the streets, and even after the umbrella broke, was lost, or replaced, that moment of dryness, of dignity remained. It is easy to forget how much of history is made not in battles or palaces, but in small rooms with steam kettles and stained fingers. Yet we must ask, what happened when these hands were no longer enough, when the slow work of many was replaced by the swift work of few? The Lefevre workshop did not end in fire, scandal, or revolution. Its end, like much of its existence, was quiet, subtle, a slow erosion rather than a collapse, but like a stone smoothed by time, the workshop bore the marks of change long before the final door was closed. Let us return one last time to that narrow building in the 11th arrondissement. The winter of 1903 was particularly bitter. The Seine froze in places. Black smoke from coal stoves painted the sky in shades of exhaustion. Inside the workshop, fewer gas lamps were lit now. Some workstations stood empty. Pascal was gone. He had left that summer, having saved enough to buy a second-hand bicycle and enroll in a mechanical trade school. He wrote occasionally letters addressed to Monsieur Lefevre et les Auteurs. His last letter spoke of machines that could cut steel with pressurized water. "Imagine," he wrote, "an umbrella rib made without a file." Jules had read that letter aloud, then folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer that held old invoices and unused seals. The rise of mass production. In 1901, the new umbrella factory in Seine-Town unveiled a fully mechanized assembly line. A single operator could produce an umbrella frame every 3 minutes. The silk canopies were pre-cut in uniform sizes and glued instead of stitched. Handles were imported from Germany and made of polished plastic bakelite, they called it. The Lefevre workshop couldn't compete. Even their most efficient month, February 1902, only produced 172 umbrellas. Jules reduced the staff to 3, himself, Marion, and Etienne. Orders from boutiques slowed. Even Le Bon Marché stopped ordering. Clients wanted cheaper models, faster delivery, lighter materials. Lefevre's umbrellas were heavier, yes, but more durable. Yet durability no longer mattered to the fashionable. The disposable had become desirable. Farewell to familiar tools. One by one, the tools of the trade found their way to corners of the room, unused and dusted only out of habit. The cutting board, with its decades of grooves, was replaced by pre-sized silk squares Jules bought wholesale. The rib alignment rack was used only for repairs, no longer for assembly. The varnish kettle sat cold most days, its lid rusting, the beeswax stiff in the jar beside it. Marion still stitched, though less frequently. She began bringing her own lamp from home. Her eyesight had weakened, and the workshop's remaining gaslights cast uneven shadows. She stitched by memory more than sight. Her canopies were still the tightest in the district. Those who knew quality still asked for her work. Etienne began speaking of retirement, not formally, not with finality, just in passing. "Perhaps I'll go live with my nephew in Dijon," he once muttered. "He raises chickens. They don't need umbrellas." Jules did not respond. The last order. The final order came not from a shop, but from a former client, a widow whose husband had bought his first umbrella from Lefebvre in 1887. She wanted a black umbrella, plain, with a wooden handle in his memory. Marion stitched the canopy with care. Etienne shaped the rib slowly. Jules himself steamed and bent the handle. They worked without speaking, each action practiced beyond thought. When it was complete, they examined it in silence. It was objectively unremarkable, but in it lived the full memory of 1,000 others. The shape of Marion's needlework, the angle of Etienne's rivets, the curve of Jules' polish. It was an umbrella in the truest sense of the word, a covering, a ritual, a craft. They wrapped it in wax paper, tied it with twine, and sealed it with the old red stamp. No one spoke when it left the shop. The closure. In the spring of 1904, Jules decided not to renew the lease. Rent had gone up again. The landlord wanted to convert the space into a millinery. Hats were fashionable now, umbrellas, not so much. The workers gathered for the last time on a gray morning in April. They drank weak coffee. Marion brought brioche. Etienne brought a bottle of red wine saved from New Year's. They cleared the benches, packed the tools into crates, and swept the floor with a hand broom Jules had used for 22 years. No speeches. No photographs, just the sound of boxes closing and memories packing themselves into silence. Jules stood at the doorway as the others walked off. He didn't lock the door. There was nothing left to protect. He did, however, take one item with him, a small umbrella made in 1883, one of the first ever produced in the shop. It had a cracked handle and a fraying edge, but it still opened smoothly. What remained? In the years that followed, the building became a hat shop, then a butcher, then an empty shell. By the 1950s, no one remembered the name Lefebvre in the 11th arrondissement. The few remaining umbrellas that bore his stamp were scattered across attics and antique shops. Occasionally, one appeared in an auction catalog, vintage Parisian umbrella, estimated 1890s, hand-stitched. Most, however, were lost, torn by wind, left on trams, thrown out when they bent in the wrong place. But the impact of that little workshop, the silent dignity of its labor, lived on in ways no historian could easily track. It lived in the people who had been kept dry walking home from shifts, in the gentlemen who shielded their wives from drizzle on rainy Sunday walks, in the mothers who carried groceries beneath their canopies. The workshop didn't change the world, but it touched it, one drop of rain at a time. The quiet power of the ordinary. History tends to celebrate the loud, wars, revolutions, inventions. But under those thundering moments lie thousands of rooms like the Lefebvre workshop. Small, consistent, deliberate spaces where lives unfold in quiet resilience. The workers of that shop didn't seek glory. They sought precision, stability, dignity. They didn't innovate, but they endured. And in the end, isn't that a form of history too? We often ask what greatness means, but perhaps the better question is, what happens to the world when the quiet ones put down their tools for the last time? Before the grand avenues, before the metro, before Paris became the city of lights and postcards, it was the city of buckets, of wet feet and steam rising from alleys, of aprons soaked before noon and knuckles raw by dusk. In 1892, Paris was a humming machine of industry and elegance. But hidden behind the grand facades and the shining shop fronts were the washerwomen les blanchiseuses, a class of laborers whose work held the city together, even as their names slipped from its history. This is their story, not one of overt rebellion or banner-waving protest, but of slow transformation through endurance, sisterhood, and soapy water. The day begins. The average washerwoman's day began before dawn, often by 4:30 in the morning. In cramped apartments along the edges of working-class neighborhoods, Belleville, Mainaumonton, or the slopes of Montmartre, women lit fires under kettles, wrapped their heads in cloth to ward off the morning cold, and began sorting laundry into baskets by category: whites, coloreds, linens, fine things. Some women worked from home, known as blankiseuses en chamber, but most took their loads to the Lavoir's public washhouses located along the Seine and Canal Saint-Martin, or in the network of municipal facilities built after 1851 by decree of Baron Haussmann. These lavoirs were architectural contradictions, open to the elements yet partially roofed, humid yet freezing in winter. Long wooden platforms supported wash basins made of stone or wood. Hot water was scarce. Soap was rough. Bleach was mostly ash and lye. And still, by the time the sun rose over Paris, the banks of the river were alive with the rhythmic slap of soaked fabric against wooden paddles. Who were the washerwomen? The blankiseuses were not a homogeneous group. Some were older women who had never married. Others were widows. Many were single mothers. A surprising number were young girls under the age of 16, pulled from school to support their households. Their work was divided into roles. The laveuses, the washers, who beat and scrubbed the laundry in cold water. The rinseuses, the rinsers, who plunged garments into fresh water to clear out the soap. The repasseuses, the ironers, who returned home with the clean, damp garments to dry and press them. It was backbreaking work, kneeling on wooden slats, fingers submerged in icy water, lifting wet sheets that weighed more than a small child. They earned little. Often, they were paid by the piece. A fine linen blouse might earn a few centimes. A large household's laundry might bring in a few francs, just enough for coal, bread, and soap for the next day. Yet washerwomen were also known for their independence. Unlike domestic servants, they did not live under a master's roof. They controlled their hours. They could refuse clients, and they built tightly woven communities around their labor. This independence came at a cost, however: exposure to injury, illness, and exploitation with little protection. The tools of the trade. Let's examine their simple but crucial tools. Battoirs, wooden beaters used to pound fabric clean. Washtubs and pails, carried on carts' backs or precariously balanced on hips. Soap, often homemade or bought from markets in gritty bars, usually based on animal fat and soda ash. Bleach, a mix of lye, ash, and occasionally vinegar, harsh on fabric, worse on skin. Irons, heated on stoves and weighed several kilograms each. Sometimes two were used in tandem, so one stayed hot while the other was in use. There was no glamour here, only steam, sweat, and the persistence of people determined not to disappear. The lavoirs, more than just washhouses. The public washhouses were places of labor, but they were also places of power. Women gossiped, exchanged news, discussed prices, births, deaths, and occasionally politics. In a society where many women had no public voice, the lavoir was a space of informal democracy. They formed collectives, unofficial, undocumented unions in all but name. Older women mentored the young. They loaned soap and food. They protected each other from harassment by clients or city officials. In fact, the term lavoir politique was sometimes used in satirical newspapers to describe spaces where women plotted more than laundry strategies. And every March, they gathered for the My Carême parade, an event where washerwomen celebrated themselves in flamboyant costumes. The queen of the washerwomen was crowned, usually the most respected among them. It was a brief escape, a moment of dignity from the drudgery of their daily lives. Hidden hazards. The health toll was immense. Constant exposure to water led to arthritis, skin infections, and respiratory illnesses. In the winter months, hands turned blue from cold. In the summer, they cracked from heat and lye. Washerwomen were frequently cited in medical reports of the era as examples of early physical deterioration. One doctor wrote in 1888 that the Blankisuse ages by the hour, not the year. Still they worked. They had to. There was no pension, no rest, no fallback. A missed day meant unpaid rent or an empty pantry. A reputation both feared and celebrated. Washerwomen occupied a strange place in French society. They were romanticized in art and literature painted by Renoir and Degas, written into poems by Baudelaire. Always rosy-cheeked, with rolled sleeves and laughter on their lips. In reality, they were seen as brash, loud, even vulgar. They were often accused of licentious behavior, especially those who worked by the riverbanks where their rolled-up skirts scandalized the bourgeois eye. They were called gueuses by the upper-class slang for unruly women. And yet, every household relied on them. The elegant gowns of opera patrons, the linens of aristocrats, the uniforms of schoolboys, they all passed through the hands of washerwomen. Without them, the appearance of Paris would have collapsed into filth. A faint turning point. By 1890, mechanical laundries began to appear. The first steam-powered laundries opened in the outskirts, run by male engineers and managed like factories. They promised speed, consistency, and less trouble. But few Parisians trusted these early machines. They tore delicate fabric. They didn't get the collars crisp enough. And most importantly, they were impersonal. For now, the washerwomen held their place. Still, questions began to swirl in the steam. Would machines take their work? Could collectives form real unions? Would women ever gain formal protection under labor laws? The answers would come slowly over the next 2 decades, but the stirrings of change had begun. The washerwomen of Paris didn't stage a revolution in the streets, but they showed, through years of quiet, communal effort, that dignity could be built from soap suds and stubbornness. And so we leave them, bent at the knees, sleeves rolled, singing over steaming buckets, as the Seine flows quietly by. By the closing years of the 19th century, Paris was shedding its skin once again. Gaslight flickered on damp cobblestones. The hum of factories could be heard through the thinner parts of the stone facades, and far from the stages of the Opéra or the salons of Montmartre, the Blankisuses, the washerwomen of Paris, continued their work in rhythm with the city's pulse. Yet underneath the splashing of basins and the scraping of paddles, something else stirred. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. A subtle shift in power, structure, and the very way labor was understood. And at the heart of it, half submerged in suds, were the washerwomen. The evolution of the lavoirs. When Baron Haussmann modernized Paris in the mid-19th century, part of his grand vision included hygiene not just for appearances, but for public health. Thus, the construction of lavoirs publics, public washhouses, was considered almost a form of civic salvation. By 1895, over 150 lavoirs operated in Greater Paris, either on the riverbanks, beside canals, or tucked behind markets. Each had its own character, determined by the women who worked there. Some were more formal, even organized fees were posted, rules enforced. Others were chaotic, laundry mixed up, rumors louder than scrubbing, and tools stolen if left unattended. Yet all served the same fundamental purpose, giving women a place to work outside of a man's control. The lavoirs also became one of the few public institutions in which working-class women dominated the environment. Male supervision was rare. Enforcement of rules, informal though it was, came from within, a kind of matriarchal microdemocracy. In many ways, the lavoirs were early laboratories of female labor independence. The fabric of solidarity. Though washerwomen were often stereotyped as quarrelsome or gossipy, they operated within intricate, supportive social systems. Newcomers were taught how to read, a piece of laundry, whether it needed to be boiled or beaten, which soap would preserve color, which stitch held the most. No woman truly worked alone. Each depended on the rhythm and timing of others, the rinsers, the wringers, the dryers. They shared child care, food, rent, sometimes even husbands. In a society where poverty and illness were constant companions, sharing was not virtue, it was necessity. Many washerwomen organized informal lending circles, pooling small amounts of money to be distributed on a rotating basis. These mutual aid systems allowed women to survive illness, pay for a child's shoes, or buy coal in winter. Though invisible to official histories, these systems were the backbone of survival. But perhaps most important of all was their language, a unique slang known as lauschibum, a kind of butcher's cant that blended argot with syllabic inversion. Originally a male trade language, washerwomen adopted and altered it for their own. Through this coded language, they could talk about customers, police, or local politics without risk. It made them both anonymous and powerful. Politics in aprons. While washerwomen rarely appeared on political rosters, they often acted as the vanguard of working-class protest. In the summer of 1897, for example, a heat wave caused water shortages in several arrondissements. The city prioritized industrial water use over public washhouses, closing 8 lavoirs without notice. The result, a spontaneous protest. Over 200 washerwomen from Belleville marched to the Hotel de Ville, aprons soaked and batwars in hand. They didn't chant slogans. They didn't burn anything. But they sat on the steps refusing to move until a city official came to speak with them. The next day, water service was restored. It was not called a strike. It was not recorded in the major papers, but within washerwomen's circles it became legend. Encroaching machines. By the turn of the century, the washing machine was no longer theoretical. While still too expensive for most homes, steam-powered laundries were popping up across the outskirts of Paris, particularly in the rapidly industrializing suburbs like Ivry-sur-Seine and Saint-Denis. These establishments promised cleaner linens, faster turnaround, and uniform pricing. Their advertisements emphasized modernity, efficiency, uniformity, mechanical superiority. But for many Parisians, especially the middle class, trust in human touch persisted. Machines might wash sheets but not lace, not embroidery, not heirlooms. Even so, the writing was on the wall, and the washerwomen knew it. Some tried to adapt, sending their children to learn reading and arithmetic so they could work in the mechanical laundries. Others doubled down on quality, offering higher-end services to niche clientele. A few formed cooperatives, collective washhouses run by women themselves, attempting to modernize while retaining autonomy. These experiments were often underfunded and short-lived, but they hinted at something larger, the instinct to resist invisibility. The home as battlefield. One less visible battle played out in the home. Washerwomen, especially those who worked from their apartments, found themselves in constant conflict with landlords over moisture, smells, and drainage. A typical complaint in tenant logs from 1893 reads, "Madame Blanchett continues to wash linens in her third-floor flat. The hallway smells of vinegar and her dripping sheets fall upon my balcony. She must be stopped." Washerwomen were seen as disruptive to the order of bourgeois domestic life. They blurred the line between labor and home, between female service and female agency. One landlord tried to evict a tenant for airing bloomers in public view. The case was dismissed, but the message was clear: washerwomen belonged out of sight. The Carême Parade, a festival of the forgotten. And yet each year, washerwomen stepped into the spotlight. Carême, the mid-Lenten festival that allowed for one day of joy amid fasting, was claimed by Les Blanchiseuses as their own. It began as a modest celebration in the 1830s, but by the late 19th century, it had evolved into a full-fledged procession. dressed in elaborate costumes, some mocking royalty, others caricaturing customers. The women paraded through Paris with music and makeshift floats. The queen of the washerwomen, elected from among their ranks, rode at the center, holding a symbolic batwar like a scepter. For many, it was the only day of the year they were seen not as laborers, but as women of pride and spectacle. The public watched with a mix of amusement and respect. Even the newspapers gave it brief mention, often with a tone of affectionate condescension. Yet within the community, this day mattered. It reminded them of their unity, of their history, and of their place in the city's living fabric. A dimming future. As the century waned, so too did the certainty of the washerwoman's role. Paris was electrifying. The metro opened in 1900. Apartment buildings installed indoor plumbing. New hygiene standards began to alter how laundry was managed altogether. Young girls increasingly chose factory work over the lavoirs. It was hard, yes, but paid better, and carried the illusion, however faint, of upward mobility. Even those who stayed in the trade knew the lavoirs were fatting. Some were converted into storage buildings. Others were abandoned, their stones cracked and overgrown. Still, the blankets uses persisted for a while longer. Because that's what they had always done. They held the city's linens in their hands, but their real labor, the quiet resistance, the collective wisdom, the survival in a system built to overlook them, was far less visible, yet no less vital. Still, one must ask, what happens to a profession when its invisibility becomes complete? When the work is gone and the workers fade without record, without title, without monument? By the early years of the 20th century, the great chorus of blankets-uses, the washerwomen of Paris, began to fall silent. Not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily, like a slow drain. The rhythm of hands slapping wet cloth, the sizzle of hot irons, the morning steam drifting from rooftops, it all began to vanish. And as the washhouses emptied, the women who had scrubbed Paris clean for a century slowly faded from view, their labor absorbed into machines, private homes, and the anonymity of modernity. Machines take the basin. The industrial laundry machine, a technology first developed in the 1860s, had matured by the early 1900s into a reliable, repeatable process. Steam, gears, and heat replaced wrists, soap, and sun. Large commercial laundries opened along the periphery of Paris. Names like El Hygiene Manager and Blanchisserie Moderne advertised not just cleanliness, but progress. White coats replaced aprons. Timetables replaced water buckets. These factories employed workers, yes, but not like the old lavoirs. The communal aspect was gone. The mutual aid circles dissolved. Work was clocked, supervised, and often alienating. The tools no longer belonged to the women who used them. By 1910, public washhouses had closed in over a dozen arrondissements. The Seine no longer echoed with the slap of fabric. What had once been a public ritual became a silent transaction behind brick walls. Ironically, many of the very washerwomen who had resisted formal employment were forced to seek it in these very factories as ironers, folders, or sorters. They became part of the same system that had displaced them. The final march. One last great gathering of washerwomen took place during my carême in 1906. The parade was smaller than years before. The queen of the washerwomen that year, Madame Estelle Duvivier, aged 61, wore a crown made of clothespins. Her scepter was wrapped in violet ribbon. The crowd cheered, but fewer washerwomen marched. Some said it felt more like a farewell than a celebration. The next year, the parade was canceled due to police concerns over public order. It was never revived in full. The fragmenting of a world. With the disappearance of the lavoirs, other things vanished too. The linguistic communities, like the secret slang of Lauschebum. The oral tradition, songs sung during rinsing, passed down from mother to daughter. The elder networks, where older washerwomen were revered as keepers of knowledge. The rituals of repair, mending a torn apron or stitching initials in borrowed towels. Washerwomen were not merely workers, they were custodians of microcultures. Their disappearance represented not only the loss of a job, but the disintegration of a social class. Unlike factory workers or seamstresses, washerwomen were often left out of unionization efforts. Their work was too scattered, too fluid, too informal. By the time feminist and socialist groups began organizing domestic labor, the washerwomen had already slipped into history's blind spot. In their place, by 1925, laundry was increasingly processed in centralized plants or quietly managed at home by new housewives with indoor plumbing. By then, washing clothing had become associated not with community, but with privacy. It was something done inside, quietly, with as little fuss as possible. Cleanliness, once a product of labor and exposure, became a mark of social respectability. Ironically, the visibility that washerwomen had once claimed hanging linens from balconies, laughing across rooftops became taboo. In the modern city, laundry was supposed to be invisible. The labor remained, but the laborer disappeared. Forgotten but not gone. Not all traces vanished. In some neighborhoods, the stone foundations of old lavoirs still exist, sometimes converted into cafes or community centers. A few plaques remain, reading, Ancient Lavoir Public, 1856. Most Parisians pass them without a glance. In Montreal, an artist once painted a mural of washerwomen across an old stone wall near a housing block. The women in the painting wear red kerchiefs and beat cloth with wooden battoirs. It was vandalized with spray paint within a year, then painted over entirely. But in the archives buried in police reports, letters to city officials, and forgotten ledgers fragments remain. A complaint from a bourgeois wife that her washerwoman refused to fold shirts. A note from a lavoir owner about the rising cost of ash-based bleach. A report by a factory inspector mentioning that former blankets now work at half wages. No memoirs, no statues, just ink on aging paper. Lessons in resilience. The washerwomen of Paris never went on strike en masse. They didn't publish manifestos. Their revolution was quieter. They showed up, every day, in rain and frost, with aching backs and soaked skirts, and they supported each other not with slogans but with food, childcare, gossip, and soap. They claimed public space in a time when women were meant to stay indoors. They spoke loudly, lived visibly, and made their own rules in the margins of a city that rarely acknowledged them. In doing so, they shaped the social and hygienic fabric of one of the world's great cities. They kept Paris clean, not just its linens, but its sense of order, presentation, and domestic dignity. They were the undercurrent beneath the glamour, the women behind the gowns, the knuckles behind the starch. A closing reflection. History is often written with grand arcs and noble causes, but beneath every uniform, every banquet table, every silk curtain, someone had to scrub. When we speak of revolutions, we often look for noise. But what if revolution can be found in the quiet persistence of hands in cold water? What if dignity is not always declared, but soaked in lie and hung on a line? And what do we lose when we lose the people who once made the city shine? In the dense heart of East London, where fog mingled with coal smoke and tenements pressed together like worn books on a shelf, a peculiar scent lingered in the air, acrid, sweet, and unmistakably chemical. This was the smell of phosphorus, and for the thousands of young women and girls who worked in the match factories of late Victorian London, it was the smell of livelihood and doom. The matchstick girls, as they would later be called, were not myth, not metaphor, not Dickensian exaggeration. They were real. They were many, and they labored daily in conditions that hovered somewhere between neglect and cruelty, just to produce one of the era's most essential household items, the match. But theirs is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of quiet endurance, chemical injustice, and the early flickers of organized resistance born not in union halls or newspapers, but in long factory rooms stained yellow with powder and sweat. The Bryant and May factory, a palace of pain. On Fairfield Road in Bow, East London, stood the massive match factory of Bryant and May, established in the 1860s and one of the largest in the world by the 1880s. Its outer walls were painted white, its windows lined up in efficient symmetry. From the outside, it looked respectable, even modern. Inside, it was something else entirely. Here, hundreds of girls, some as young as 12, worked from early morning until well after sunset, dipping wooden splints into vats of chemicals, drying them in racks, boxing them by hand, and repeating the process with factory-line precision. The air was saturated with white phosphorus, a toxic substance that gave early matches their famed strike-anywhere capability, but at a profound human cost. Dust from the phosphorus coated every surface. It clung to skin, lodged in lungs, and entered mouths through the smallest yawn or sip of tea. And the consequences, over time, were both horrifying and largely ignored by those in charge. The yellow faces. Many of the girls suffered from a condition colloquially known as phossy jaw. The first signs were seemingly innocuous: toothaches, swelling of the gums, a faint glow in the dark around the jawline, a ghastly feature noted only at night, and in terrified whispers. Then came necrosis. The jawbone would begin to die slowly and painfully. Skin would discolor, teeth would fall out, the face became disfigured, the pain was constant, the breath turned foul. And still, many continued to work because there was no other choice. Treatment often meant the surgical removal of the affected jawbone, a procedure done without anesthetic for the poor. Recovery was rare, death eventual. Bryant and May executives denied that their matches caused this condition, despite mounting evidence and reports from European factories that had banned white phosphorus years earlier. But profits were steady and replacements cheap. A day in the life. A typical shift began at 6:30 in the morning. The girls would line up, carrying their own tea and bread, as food was not provided. They wore aprons and headscarves more to absorb sweat and phosphorus dust than for modesty. There were no gloves. Work involved standing at long tables, dipping sticks into phosphorus paste, spreading them on racks, and carefully laying them to dry. Then came boxing, a delicate task requiring speed and care, as the dried match heads could ignite with a single spark. Talking was discouraged. Mistakes were punished with docking of wages. If a girl was late, her entire day's pay might be withheld. Many of the match girls lived in the surrounding slums of Bow and Bethnal Green. They returned home at night with yellow skin, aching limbs, and raw eyes. Their clothing reeked of chemicals. Their hair often fell out in patches. They earned around 4 to 8 shillings a week, depending on their speed, age, and favor with supervisors. And yet these girls were proud. They wore ribbons in their hair on payday. They supported families. Some even taught others to read right there in the factory, using matchbox labels as flashcards. The chemistry of exploitation. To understand just how deeply the danger was embedded in their work, one must briefly understand the chemistry. White phosphorus, also known as yellow phosphorus, is highly toxic. When exposed to air, it releases a vapor that is absorbed easily through the lungs or open wounds. Even small amounts could cause organ damage over time. And yet, it was chosen over red phosphorus, a safer alternative already in use elsewhere in Europe, because red phosphorus required more complex and more expensive manufacturing processes. The choice, therefore, was not about safety but profit. Bryant and May officials maintained that their workers were properly ventilated, that masks were offered, and that incidents were rare. Inspectors were shown specially cleaned areas, but former workers and hidden letters tell a different story, one of bare rooms, ignored symptoms, and discarded complaints. The unseen solidarity. Still within these grim surroundings, the girls developed an ecosystem of mutual care. When one fell ill, others would cover her quota. Older workers passed down tips, how to breathe less deeply during certain tasks, how to rinse with vinegar to reduce irritation, how to spot the first signs of phosphorus poisoning. They formed informal alliances, watching each other's backs, covering for lateness, sharing food. Sometimes they even pooled coins to help a girl buy boots or to pay for her mother's medicine. It was not a union, but it was something else, something older and arguably stronger, survival through sisterhood. And in time, that foundation would catch fire. Strikes in the air. By the late 1880s, discontent simmered. Newspapers began to take notice, thanks in part to the work of Annie Besant, a journalist and activist who dared to step inside the Bryant and May factory and speak to the girls directly. Her 1888 exposé, White Slavery in London, ignited public outrage. Company management retaliated. Girls suspected of speaking to Besant were fired. Others were interrogated. The girls had had enough. In July 1888, nearly 1,400 matchgirls walked out, leaving behind their posts and the steady rhythm of their labor. They carried no weapons, no union cards, just their stained aprons, their hoarse voices, and the shared belief that they deserved better. The streets of Bow echoed with chants, not of revolution but of recognition. We are not dirt, we are workers. It was one of the first successful strikes by unskilled female laborers in British history. But what happened next, and what didn't says as much about the system as it does about the girls who dared to challenge it. The summer of 1888 brought an unexpected storm to East London, not one of rain, but of resistance. It began with whispers, then a single step taken outside the gates, and then another. Within hours, over 1,400 match girls, some still in their aprons, their fingers streaked with phosphorus, had left their benches behind. They didn't carry banners. They didn't sing revolutionary songs, but they had left their work. That alone was radical. They had no formal leader, no strike fund, no labor protections. They were women, many of them teenagers, regarded by society as too uneducated, too emotional, too weak to organize. But what they lacked in organization, they made up for in clarity. They wanted safety, fair pay, and to be treated like human beings. It would become known as the Matchgirls' Strike of 1888. What drove them out? The grievances were numerous, and none were new. Fines and deductions. Girls were penalized for talking, dropping matches, or arriving a few minutes late even if the factory clock was wrong. Unpaid compulsory expenses. They were required to bring their own tools and buy their own glue and brushes. Sweating. Workers were forced to maintain breakneck speeds or risk dismissal. The fastest were sometimes moved to more dangerous jobs as punishment. Health risks. Most notably, constant exposure to toxic white phosphorus, which management claimed was harmless despite mounting deaths and deformities. Firing of outspoken workers. The dismissal of a popular girl, allegedly for speaking to journalist Annie Besant, was the final spark. That July, they walked out en masse. Annie Besant and the power of witness. It's impossible to tell the story of the Matchgirls' strike without mentioning Annie Besant, a writer, theosophist, and social reformer who became a lightning rod for the movement. Besant had written a scathing article entitled White Slavery in London, which exposed the appalling conditions at Bryant and May. She printed the girls' words. She challenged the factory's denials. She showed respectable readers, many of them middle-class women, the cost of their conveniences. Management was furious. They denied every claim. They dismissed several girls suspected of being informants. They tried to smear Besant's name. But it was too late. Besant didn't create the strike, but she gave it visibility, and the girls gave it legitimacy through action. Organizing without a union. Unlike the well-documented male-led dock strikes that followed a year later, the match girls had no official structure. No union halls, no strike pay, no pamphlets. Instead, they used kitchens, street corners, and pub backrooms. They formed a strike committee, led by several older girls with respect among the workers. They called meetings. They knocked on doors to rally support. They sent representatives to speak to newspapers, clergymen, and politicians. Within days, the public tide began to turn. Middle-class sympathizers donated food and money. Public letters condemned Bryant and May. A few bold editors printed the girls' demands in full. End unjust fines and deductions. Provide proper meals and rest breaks. Improve sanitary and ventilation conditions. Remove toxic white phosphorus. Reinstate the dismissed workers. The girls had nothing to trade but their labor and their story. And people listened. Company pushback. Bryant and May did not yield easily. Executives accused the girls of lying. They claimed the strike was orchestrated by outside agitators. They offered token improvements and spread rumors that jobs would be given to new workers. But the replacements didn't come. Even desperate girls, when faced with the opportunity to break the strike, hesitated. Few wanted to take the place of a sister or neighbor. Some quietly passed food to the strikers instead. The solidarity was not just political, it was personal. After several weeks of standoff, mounting bad press, and pressure from prominent citizens, including members of Parliament, Bryant and May relented. They agreed to rehire all dismissed workers, end unjust fines, permit meals in a separate clean room, allow greater worker representation. It was not a full victory. The use of white phosphorus continued for years, but it was unprecedented. The girls had won, without weapons, without wealth, without formal power. After the strike, the aftermath brought more than improved conditions. It brought visibility. The match girls formed the Union of Women Matchmakers, one of the first unions of unskilled female workers in the UK. Though small and short-lived, it set a precedent that rippled outward. Suddenly, women factory workers across London began to wonder, if the match girls could strike, why not us? A year later, the Great Dock Strike of 1889 would take up the same call for dignity, this time with men and women marching side by side. Annie Besant, reflecting on the strike, said, "These girls had nothing but their courage, and yet they moved mountains. Life did not become easy. Victory did not bring luxury. Many girls returned to the same jobs. The factory still used phosphorus. Wages improved, but not dramatically. Illness remained. The yellow tint on their skin still marked them unmistakably as match workers. Yet something intangible had changed. They stood straighter, they spoke louder, they knew now that they were not alone. Some went on to organize in other factories. Others raised daughters who refused to take the same job. A few left London entirely. Most lived in poverty their entire lives. But they were no longer invisible. The chemistry of consequence. The fight against white phosphorus continued for another 2 decades. Despite international pressure and increasing medical documentation, Bryant and May resisted switching to red phosphorus, which was safer but more costly. Only in 1901, under immense scrutiny, did they finally make the transition. By then, hundreds had died or suffered irreparable damage. In 1906, the UK formally banned the use of white phosphorus in match production. It took nearly 20 years and hundreds of silent screams. A memory in smoke. The matchstick girls left little behind. No portraits, no memoirs, few full names. Their history lives mostly in testimonies, court records, and Besant's writings. Yet their fingerprints are everywhere. On the modern labor protections that followed, on the minimum wage debates, on the women-led unions of the early 20th century, on the slow, grinding progress of industrial safety. Every time a worker speaks out, every time a teenager demands fair pay, every time a young woman refuses silence in the face of danger, she carries the match girls with her. A final thought. The match girls' story is not one of triumph exactly. It's a story of partial victories, of fire held in small hands, of injustice faced with bare feet and stubborn wills. They did not end capitalism. They did not escape poverty. They did not receive medals. But they lit a match, and the world eventually noticed the flame. So we are left with this. What power lies dormant in the hands we overlook the most? And what if the smallest spark dropped by the quietest worker was the first light of change? By the time the 20th century reached its second decade, the factory walls that once echoed with the chatter of match girls had grown quieter. The air was cleaner. The acrid sting of phosphorus, once ever present, was gone. And yet, the ghosts remain not as specters, but as echoes in the labor reforms, union banners, and factory break rooms of the future. This final section examines what became of the match girls, what the world learned or didn't from their suffering, and how their legacy lingers in strange, forgotten corners of industrial history. After the flame, the Union of Women Matchmakers, formed in the wake of the 1888 strike, struggled to survive long-term. Lack of funding, internal pressures, and the sheer exhaustion of constant advocacy took their toll. By 1895, the union had largely dissolved. Its members scattered, some returned to domestic labor, others became active in broader socialist movements. A few never worked again, crippled by the effects of phosphorus poisoning. But the strike left its mark far beyond the East End. It shifted public opinion. Before the strike, the working poor were often dismissed as lazy or ignorant. After the strike, there was a new awareness, albeit slow and uneven, that conditions, not character, shaped the choices and futures of the poor, and that even the youngest, poorest women could organize, resist, and demand change. This shift would contribute to the rise of the new unionism movement in Britain, an effort to extend union protections beyond skilled male workers and into the broader, poorer labor force. Annie Besant continued fight. Annie Besant continued her work in social reform and labor advocacy. Though she eventually turned toward spiritualism and theosophy, a controversial path, her legacy as a champion of workers' rights was already secure. She wrote frequently of the match girls in her later years, crediting them with teaching her the meaning of ordinary courage. Her influence reached far. She supported strikes in India, promoted birth control in Britain, and founded schools for girls. But even she acknowledged that the girls themselves were the true authors of their resistance. They had no platform, no access, no voice. And yet they shouted anyway. Fossey Jaw in the shadows. Even after the 1906 ban on white phosphorus in British match production, the consequences of decades of exposure could not be undone. Fossey Jaw remained a lingering death sentence for many. Medical records, mostly handwritten and incomplete, show case after case of women living with partial jaw removals, chronic pain, disfigurement. Some received rudimentary compensation. Others died unnamed in poorhouses. Few obituaries mention the word match. For decades after, girls continued to fear the symptoms: swelling under the eye, aching teeth, yellowing skin. In factory towns, the term Fossey became slang for something unlucky, cursed, even. It faded from official language, but remained embedded in local memory. From East End to everywhere, the strike did not stop at London's borders. In the 1890s and early 1900s, match factory workers across Europe and America began organizing. Swedish women held similar strikes in Malmö. In New York, female factory workers drew inspiration from the matchgirls' tactics. The International Labor Organization, formed in 1919, would cite phosphorus-related illness as a key case in its early campaigns for workplace safety standards. In essence, the voices of girls who'd been told they were replaceable echoed into boardrooms, legislative halls, and labor conferences. And that echo remained, long after their individual names were lost. The Vanishing Factory. The original Bryant and May factory in Bow operated for over a century. But by the 1970s, automation and outsourcing had made it obsolete. The building was decommissioned and later converted into apartments and office spaces, rebranded as the Matchmaker's Wharf. Today, its exterior is preserved. The white bricks, once stained with chemical smoke, are scrubbed clean. A plaque by the door mentions the 1888 strike, but briefly. Visitors rarely stop to read it. Inside, professionals work at computers where matchgirls once dipped sticks into poison. The building survives, but its soul has moved on. The matchbox's symbol. In time, the matchbox became more than a utility, it became a symbol. For labor historians, it represents the struggle for safe working conditions. For feminists, it stands for the first flames of female industrial resistance. For political organizers, it is a case study in the power of mass action from the margins. And yet, to most people today, a matchbox is merely a relic, a dusty item in a drawer, replaced by lighters, stoves, and electronic ignitions. The object that once defined so many lives now lights candles for decoration or not at all. But maybe in that box there remains a trace of fire, not just literal but historical. A fire started not by design but by desperation. A fire that spread through silence, pain, and finally, refusal. A final reflection. There's a certain poetry in the lives of the matchstick girls. They created light for others while being consumed by darkness themselves. They were used up, worn down, and often discarded. And yet they ignited a movement that would outlast their bodies, their names, their factory. History is not only written by the powerful. Sometimes it is written in phosphorus dust, in paybooks and protest songs, in boxes handled by trembling fingers, in the eyes of young women who refuse to look down anymore. And so we ask, how many other stories lie waiting quiet, dangerous, and glowing faintly in the dark, just waiting to be struck? In the cluttered underbelly of the U.S. postal system, far from the orderly post offices and polished counters, there existed, in the late 19th century, a strange and sorrowful department, the dead letter office. This was not a fictional creation or a literary metaphor. It was a real institution with real clerks, real desks, and real mail, millions of letters each year that arrived with no destination, no return address, and no hope. And in 1870s America, a nation still healing from the Civil War, expanding westward with uneven steps, and reconfiguring its sense of self, this warehouse of undelivered words quietly chronicled the failures, hopes, and forgotten corners of a country on the move. Here, in this dusty bureaucratic limbo, were the last traces of letters no one ever read, and the people who handled them, quiet clerks with gloved hands and sharp eyes, were the unseen editors of heartbreak and human error. A government within a government. The Dead Letter Office, DLO, was officially established in 1825 but grew to prominence and complexity in the post-Civil War decades, when the volume of mail exploded. By the 1870s, it operated out of a 3-story building in Washington, D.C., with locked rooms, sorting tables, shelves of lost packages, and an army of clerks trained to inspect, decipher, and when necessary destroy mail that had nowhere to go. The scale was staggering. In 1873 alone, over 3.2 million undeliverable letters passed through the office. Thousands contained cash, coins, photographs, locks of hair, dried flowers, and trinkets. Others carried secrets, confessions, love letters, proposals, legal disputes, and final words never heard. Some had no stamp, others no address. Still others were simply illegible, scrawled in desperation or misspelling, intended for recipients who had moved west, joined the army, or died. The clerks of the dead letter office did not merely file or shred. They opened, they read, they interpreted. They were, for all intents and purposes, readers of private pain. The clerks in the shadows. The office was staffed largely by men, though by the late 1870s, a small number of women were employed, especially in handling letters suspected of containing money or valuables. Their reputations for honesty and precision were deemed superior, according to internal reports. Each clerk worked at a small desk under gaslight, wearing protective gloves and often seated for 10 hours a day. Silence was the rule. Letters were opened with small ivory knives and read quickly but carefully. Clerks developed strange skills: reading through poor grammar and phonetic spelling, deciphering bad handwriting and faded ink, recognizing regional dialects or foreign language clues, smelling letters for signs of perishables or chemicals, identifying handwriting styles that might point to known forgers or repeat correspondence. They also kept a running list of fraudulent letters. Common scams involved fake lottery wins, false inheritance claims, or counterfeit marriage proposals. But most letters were not criminal. They were lost and often terribly sincere. The art of reuniting. The dead letter office made real efforts to return mail when possible. If a letter contained a full name and city, but no street address, clerks might check city directories or previous correspondence. In some cases, they reached out to local postmasters across the country to inquire about possible recipients. If a letter contained valuables, cash, rings, or sentimental items, it was placed in a locked cabinet and logged in official records. If the contents were deemed too risky to forward, like exposed medication or spoiled food, they were destroyed. But often, the clerks found themselves holding things they had no right to read, and yet had to. A letter dated 1872, addressed only to "My dearest one, New Orleans," contained a lock of hair and the following line: "I know not if you live or if the river took you." It was never claimed. Another, written by a soldier from Fort Laramie, was addressed to Ma and Pa, Boston, Mass. No further details. Inside it read: "We made it through the blizzard, but not all of us. Please write to Mary for me. I'm tired of the wind." The envelope was marked with a thumbprint in soot. The dead letter office kept a sample archive of such letters, hundreds of them, stacked in bound ledgers and file boxes marked simply "unclaimed." Postal impermanence in a rapidly expanding nation. In 1870s America, postal infrastructure was uneven and overburdened. The railroad had expanded delivery speeds in the East and Midwest, but remote frontier towns often had unreliable or infrequent service. Town names changed frequently. New settlements popped up overnight, and others disappeared just as quickly. People moved west without notice. Soldiers were stationed at unnamed forts. Freedmen changed counties in search of work. Women married and changed surnames. Immigrants anglicized their names or adopted aliases. In such flux, a single missing detail, a wrong zip code, before zip codes even existed, a nickname, a forgotten apartment number could render a letter hopelessly adrift. And so the dead letter office became an unintended monument to American impermanence. When letters could not be returned, if a letter contained no clue whatsoever, and if, after examination, no recipient could be identified, the letter was officially destroyed, burned in large furnaces within the DLO itself. The ash was disposed of like any office waste. It is estimated that tens of millions of letters were incinerated between 1860 and 1890. Among them, wedding invitations never received, death notices never mourned, payments never claimed, forgiveness never read, love never returned. The DLO did not judge these letters. It simply tried to return them. When it couldn't, they were erased efficiently, anonymously. The fire in this case was not revolutionary. It was just hot enough to make memory into soot. Dead packages and strange finds. In addition to letters, the DLO handled undeliverable parcels. These were often opened with multiple clerks present, logged carefully, and stored until claimed. Among the more notable finds from the 1870s, a tin of wedding cake from 1863, molded solid but still wrapped in lace. A taxidermied parrot addressed to Miss Birdie, West Virginia. Dozens of hand-sewn baby bonnets, possibly part of a donation shipment never received. A bundle of Confederate bills hidden inside a shoe. A violin with no strings, addressed simply to Daddy. Most of these items were auctioned off after months of remaining unclaimed. Others were destroyed. But every object had a story, and none were ever fully known. A bureau of broken threads. There is something almost sacred in the concept of a letter. It assumes delivery. It assumes reading. It assumes connection. But the dead letter office was a contradiction to all of that. It was a government facility built not to deliver messages, but to mourn them, to read and destroy, to protect and erase. Its clerks were not villains. They were, in their own way, archivists of failed communication, witnesses to the minor tragedies of a growing nation. So we are left with an unresolved question. What becomes of a country's soul when so many of its words go unheard? If you walked into the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., in the winter of 1877, you might be surprised at how little it resembled the chaos of the letters it housed. The building was clean, orderly, and quiet. Gas lamps burned steadily overhead. A faint smell of glue and aging paper hung in the air. But it was the silence that struck visitors most, the kind of heavy hush found only in places where people handle the last remains of something once alive. And yet, inside this stillness, a different kind of noise played out every day, a noise made of failed communication, unanswered longing, and accidental confessions. The clerks who worked here, government employees paid by the letter, in some cases became expert not only in identifying ink and handwriting, but in recognizing the patterns of human desperation. This section is about them. The invisible historians. The dead letter clerks were among the most peculiar class of government employees in the United States. Unlike postmasters or delivery men, they weren't visible to the public. They had no uniforms, no counters, and rarely appeared in newspaper stories. Yet they read more about the real America than almost anyone in Washington. Their job descriptions were dry: to inspect, examine, and attempt the return of undelivered correspondence deemed misdirected, incomplete, illegible, or invalid in content or format. But the job was anything but mechanical. A clerk might handle hundreds of letters per day, many of which were personal in the most piercing way. The emotional labor was unacknowledged. There was no training in how to read the final letter from a dying man to a wife who had already moved on, or a letter from a freedman trying to find his family, with only a plantation name and a guess. Some clerks began to keep journals unofficial and against policy. These entries weren't published, but a few have survived in archives, offering glimpses into the emotional toll of the work. Today I opened a letter written in pencil on the back of a newspaper. A man named Eli wrote to his brother George. It was dated 3 years ago. I think George is dead. I think Eli might be too. I read it 3 times before I moved on. Others confessed to dreaming in handwriting letters that looped and vanished, signatures they couldn't quite place, entire sentences repeating in their sleep. Women in the dead letter office. By the late 1870s, the office had begun employing more women, especially in sensitive departments. Official reports from the Postmaster General noted, "The lady clerks have proven exceptionally precise in matters involving correspondence of personal or financial importance." Translation: they were trusted with opening letters that contained money, rings, personal effects, and emotional content. These women were called upon to read between the lines to detect not just the addressee, but the nature of the relationship. A letter beginning with "My dearest Mr. W." and ending with "Forever yours in Christ" might be judged a mourning letter. A note addressed only to "Sweetheart" might be guessed at by its postmark or enclosure. Clerks like Miss Eliza Stroud and Miss Annie T. Emerson handled hundreds of letters a week. Some they managed to return, others they documented carefully before consigning to the fire. They wore gloves not only to protect themselves from old ink and dirty paper, but from the emotions inside. Strange category, stranger contents. Clerks at the DLO were taught to mentally categorize what they handled. Some broad categories included letters of longing, unmailed or unclaimed proposals, declarations of love or apologies. Letters of anger, threats, ultimatums, anonymous accusations. Letters of faith, prayers sent to God to be delivered in heaven. Some were sent by children. Letters of confusion, misaddressed, misnamed, often from new immigrants or the illiterate. Letters from the margins, written by prisoners, former slaves, runaways, or those with no fixed address. Among the many strange items found in these letters: human teeth, sometimes sent as odd tokens of affection or, more grimly, medical requests. Photographs scratched out, faces crossed off by penknife yet still mailed. Lottery tickets, good luck charms, or bits of burnt cloth meant to ward off illness. A note that read simply, "If no one reads this, then I have already gone." The DLO had a separate department for letters considered to have no commercial value but high personal sensitivity. These were logged but rarely returned, for fear of causing distress. Lost and found, and lost again. Once in a while, something remarkable happened. A letter was returned. A clerk would spot a clue, cross-reference a city directory, send a telegram to a distant postmaster, and confirm a match. The letter would be carefully resealed, stamped "dead letter found," and sent along its way. But these were rare. The vast majority of letters sat in storage for months before being destroyed. Some were auctioned, others incinerated. A few were saved unofficially by clerks who couldn't bear to throw them away. These saved pieces now sit in obscure museum archives or private collections, marked "anonymous" or "correspondent unknown." In one case, a bundle of 16 letters addressed to Miss Josephine, Kansas Territory, was discovered decades later in a drawer at the Smithsonian. None had ever been opened by their intended recipient. And yet they had survived. The bureaucracy of human loss. In many ways, the dead letter office served as a mirror not just of a person's mistakes, but of the country's identity crisis. The United States in the 1870s was expanding, but unevenly. The postal system symbolized unity, but the dead letter office showed its cracks. Illiteracy, transience, migration and forced movement, displacement after war, racial and class barriers to communication. A letter misaddressed by a poor farmer, or misspelled by a recently emancipated man, or written in broken English by an immigrant, all these ended in the same place: nowhere. The clerks were not to blame. The senders often were not either. But the silence of the dead letter office revealed the truth. Even in a democracy, not all voices make it through. Fires and forgetting. By policy, unclaimed letters were destroyed after a fixed time burned en masse, with only the date and source logged. One clerk wrote in 1878, "Today we burned over 4,000 letters. I watched the smoke curl upward. It smelled like perfume and old ink. There was a breeze. I wonder if anyone breathed in a word they once wrote and forgot." This destruction was not malicious, it was procedure. But it meant that millions of human connections simply vanished. And no one knew they were gone. So we are left to wonder. What truths, what reconciliations, admissions, kindnesses, regrets were consumed before ever reaching their destination? And if a letter is never read, does it still matter that it was written? By the final decades of the 19th century, the United States Post Office had grown into one of the largest civilian organizations in the country. It spanned coasts, climbed mountain passes, and ran through the veins of every new town and tent camp. It was fast becoming the national circulatory system. And yet, at the center of this great artery of communication, there remained a strange and steady blockage: the dead letter office, humming away with quiet persistence, swallowing unsent love, unpaid debts, final farewells, and the quiet prayers of strangers. In its walls, lost intention became institutionalized. This final section is not only about the end of a letter's journey, but also about what it means to almost connect, to write a thing so full of meaning, only to have it disappear into bureaucracy. The expansion and automation of misdelivery. By the 1880s, the volume of dead letters continued to climb, now exceeding 5 million per year. As railroads, telegraphs, and westward expansion made communication faster, they also made it more fragile. A single wrong digit, misspelled surname, or unrecognized return address sent even the most important message directly into a pile labeled unclaimed. The United States government responded by formalizing the process. Special rooms were designated for foreign mail. Clerks were assigned to monitor repeat senders. Reports were submitted monthly to Congress outlining destruction totals, returns, and valuables recovered. But this professionalization only reinforced what had become quietly apparent. A huge portion of human communication was unfinishable. Even in a country obsessed with forward motion and manifest destiny, most letters died before arrival. The bureau as graveyard. For all its bureaucratic polish, the dead letter office had funeral-like qualities. Letters were read and recorded. Objects were cataloged if possible. Then everything was destroyed, burned, buried in archives, or sold at auction to strangers. It was a mass, impersonal loss, but within it were individual tragedies. A man sent a letter to his sister in Arizona in 1875. It was addressed only Maggie, Tucson. Inside, $5 and a note. "Get the medicine. Tell Ma I'm trying." It was never claimed. A woman in Richmond sent her wedding ring wrapped in paper with a note that read, "If he won't marry me, then let someone else have it." No address, no name. The ring was sold 5 years later in a government auction. Some items were simply inexplicable. A sealed envelope filled with ash and a note that read, "All that is left." These were not fictional constructs. They were real entries, recorded by clerks who could not afford sentiment, and yet quietly bore the weight of it. Memory without memory. Because so much of the dead letter office's contents were destroyed as a matter of policy, we will never know the full emotional map it contained. But fragments remain. In faded ledger entries. In court cases where letters were cited as evidence of intent. In congressional reports where tallies became narratives. And in the objects that somehow slipped through. For example, a few items from the 1870s survive in collections. A small music box addressed to baby Emmy, with a note written in phonetic French. A pressed flower between 2 Bible pages marked to Ella, from her sister too late. a child's drawing of a house with "Send me home" scrawled across it. Most items had no provenance, their owners could not be found, their meanings only guessed. And yet, to hold one today, an envelope with no stamp, a postcard with no recipient, is to hold a piece of unresolved history. From dead letters to modern ghosts. As technology advanced, so too did the methods of avoiding misdelivery. Zip codes, barcoding, automated sorting, and digital tracking have nearly eliminated the dead letter office as it once existed. Today, its remnants have been folded into a division known simply as the Mail Recovery Center, a sterile, far more efficient system with no ivory knives, no gaslight, and far less reading. Letters are not typically opened. Mail with cash or valuables is stored briefly. Unclaimed items are auctioned. Data privacy laws have ended the practice of reading for clues. It is cleaner, smarter, and almost entirely impersonal. But in that progress, something was lost. The ability to hear, if only briefly, the human voice beneath the paper. The clerks fade away. The men and women who once served as caretakers of lost messages rarely appear in the annals of postal history. No statues commemorate them. No memoirs were published. Most retired quietly, their minds filled with snippets of the nation's unspoken sorrows. One unnamed clerk wrote, late in life, "I never thought I'd know so many people I never met. I learned how Americans apologize, how they grieve, how they flirt, and how they lie because they all did so in envelopes." This is perhaps the closest thing we have to an epitaph for the dead letter clerks. Legacy in silence. So what does the dead letter office leave behind? It leaves us a lesson in humility, that even in an age obsessed with communication, most messages still fail to arrive. It reminds us that intention is not always enough, that words, however heartfelt, still need roads, and sometimes the roads crumble. It teaches us that so much of history lives in the things that weren't received, the orders never filled, the love never known, the warning too late. And it asks a final haunting question. How do we measure the weight of all the words that went unread? Final reflection. Every person has a letter they never sent. Every country has a pile of truth that went missing. And somewhere, perhaps still sitting in an old locked cabinet or moldering in a forgotten archive, is a bundle of envelopes that once mattered more than anything to someone. The dead letter office was not a mistake, it was a necessity. But it was also a mirror, and in it we still see ourselves. Trying to reach, trying to explain, trying above all to be heard. Even now, in the heart of 19th century France, long before baguettes became a national symbol or croissants a tourist cliché, there existed an almost invisible ritual, the daily baking of bread. Not in sleek patisseries or glass-windowed cafes, but in smoke-blackened rooms, where the air was heavy with dust, sweat, and rising yeast. This is the story of those rooms, and the people often unseen who fed entire villages from the heat of a brick oven. To walk into a village bakery at 2:00 a.m. in the year 1867 was to enter a world already in motion, a world of precision and exhaustion, a world built not for luxury or leisure but for survival. Because in rural France, bread was not food, it was sustenance, currency, and custom. And the baker, though rarely celebrated, was as essential as the mayor or the priest. The place, a village bakery in the Rhone Valley. Let us begin in a small village nestled in the Rhone countryside. Its name does not matter. There were hundreds like its stone houses clustered around a single square, a church bell overhead, and somewhere near the well, a communal oven or a small family-run boulangerie. Our bakery is a modest structure, thick walls, a soot-stained chimney, a wooden door worn smooth from decades of deliveries and early risers. Inside, a low ceiling traps the warmth. Dust particles float in the golden gaslight like lazy snow. The hearth before a pane is wide and deep, built of stone, its inner belly already radiating heat. The fire has been lit since midnight. Nearby, sacks of flour sit stacked like sleeping animals. Each weighs more than 40 kilograms and has been hauled in on a cart from a local mill. It is not the pristine white flour we know today, it is stone-milled, coarse with flecks of husk, richer in nutrients, heavier in the hand. The smell is unmistakable: yeast, scorched wood, damp cloth, and the beginning of hunger. The baker and his world. His name is Henry, but no one calls him that. To the village, he is simply le boulanger. He is in his mid-40s, though the grooves in his face speak of more years than that. He has been baking since he was 14. Henry sleeps in shifts 3 hours at dusk, maybe an hour in the afternoon. His wife Claudine tends to the storefront. Their 2 sons, aged 11 and 13, help with water hauling and dough shaping. The older boy will one day inherit the bakery. The younger, perhaps, will join the priesthood, or so Claudine hopes. Henry begins his day in darkness, barefoot, standing on wooden slats to keep off the cold stone floor. He doesn't speak. He doesn't yawn. His body knows the rhythm by now. The first task is water. Flour, water, salt, and fire. All bread begins with 4 elements: flour, water, salt, and yeast. Yeast, in Henry's time, was a complex business. While commercial yeast was available in the cities by the 1870s, most village bakers still relied on leaven, a naturally fermented starter made from flour and water, carefully fed each day like a sour-smelling pet. Henry keeps his leaven in a ceramic pot wrapped in cloth. He stirs it gently. The smell is sharp, acidic, alive, a sign that it's ready. He pours water into a wide wooden trough known as le patron. Then comes the flour, sifted by hand, and salt measured by palm. The starter is added last. Now begins the work of kneading. He does not use a machine. There is no such thing here. Kneading is done with his forearms, pushing down into the sticky mass with weight and rhythm. 15 minutes, then rest. Then 10 more minutes. The dough is heavy and uneven at first, then elastic, then strangely beautiful. The silent labor. Baking bread is not noisy. It is, in many ways, a craft of silence. The dough is formed into large rounds, boule, or long, thick loaves resembling modern batards. Each is placed on a linen cloth to rise, under layers of fabric to keep in warmth. The linen is never washed, only dried. It carries the memory of past loaves. Henry works by instinct. He touches the dough and knows if the yeast is too aggressive. He presses his thumb to a boule and feels the air trapped inside. He listens for the faint creak of expanding gluten. At 4:15 a.m., the oven is ready. The fire is raked out. Coals are swept aside. The temperature is tested not by thermometer but by throwing a pinch of flour onto the stone floor. If it browns slowly, the oven is perfect. If it blackens too fast, they wait. Henry loads the loaves with a long-handled wooden peel. He wears no gloves. The oven swallows the loaves like a mouth. The door is sealed. And then, for 25 minutes, there is nothing to do but wait and listen. The storefront and the queue. By 5:30 a.m., the village is stirring. Claudine opens the shuttered window facing the square. She places a small sign that reads, "Pain Chaud hot bread." The first customer is always the same, Madame Bellamy, widow, aged 74. She buys a small loaf every day and always says the same thing, "Still warm as it should be." Soon the others arrive. The butcher's boy, trading sausage links for 2 loaves. The schoolteacher, asking for a pain de seigle cut in half. A child with a coin in one mitten, sent by a sleepy mother. The bread is still warm. It steams in the cool air. People cradle it like treasure. Claudine wraps each loaf in old newspaper or linen, depending on the customer. She smiles but does not speak much. The line moves quickly. By 7:00 a.m., the day's bread is sold. Bread as ritual, bread as control. In 19th century rural France, bread was not a side dish. It was the center of every meal. A family of 6 might consume 2 kilos of bread per day. Children were taught to hold their bread properly, to never waste crumbs. Bread was dipped in coffee, wine, or milk. It was served with cheese, with onions, with nothing. To waste bread was considered almost sacrilegious. And for bakers, that gave them an unusual role not just as food producers, but as quiet gatekeepers of hunger. During times of poor harvest, bakers sometimes watered down flour, added fillers like potato or chestnut, or adjusted sizes to make the loaves last longer. Prices were regulated by local officials. A baker who overcharged could face public shamming, or worse, legal penalty. Henry remembers the spring of 1864, when a grain shortage nearly shut the bakery down. He made smaller loaves. He worked through the night, and he still received a brick through his window. The return to silence. By mid-morning, Henry sits down for the first time. His hands ache. His face is powdered with flour. His shirt clings with sweat. He eats cold bread with cheese, drinks water from a tin cup. Then he climbs the narrow stairs and sleeps for an hour if he can. Claudine sweeps, the boys wash the pans, the sourdough starter is fed. And tomorrow it begins again. Bread is a simple thing, but in this small village it carries time, custom, and the weight of continuity. And so, in every crust, in every crumb, a question is baked quietly into the daily rhythm. If the bread does not rise tomorrow, what will we become? By the 1870s, the rural French bakery was more than just a place to purchase bread. It was an institution, a regulator of hunger, a symbol of trust, and a reluctant participant in the ever-present negotiations between poverty and survival. The bakery was the first place awake in the village, and for many, it was the last place of dignity when all else faltered. You could be in debt, widowed, or sick, but you still needed bread. And in France, where revolutions had once begun over the price of it, the baker was not free to simply do as he pleased. He was watched. Bread and the bureaucracy. Baking bread in France during the 19th century was a regulated trade, bound by local laws, traditions, and moral expectations. Each commune or town had a prix-du pain, a standardized bread price posted by local officials. This price fluctuated based on grain supply, which was monitored weekly. Bakers were required to post their prices publicly and could be punished for deviating without approval. There were also rules about weight. Each loaf had to weigh a prescribed amount. Bakers sometimes added moisture to make a loaf heavier. This was a punishable offense. Bake days. In smaller villages with a communal oven, baking schedules were rotated. Night baking. In larger towns, night baking was sometimes restricted due to the risk of fire or perceived public disturbance. These rules were remnants of ancient regime customs, carried over despite the upheaval of the French Revolution, Napoleon's rise and fall, and the eventual establishment of the Third Republic. Henry, like most village bakers, had a ledger not just for his accounts, but for recording grain deliveries, flour weights, and batches. Periodically, an official would visit to check these entries. Scarcity and substitution. Not every year was good. France, like most of Europe, faced recurring agricultural crises. One particularly bad harvest in 1870, made worse by the political chaos of the Franco-Prussian War, led to widespread flour shortages. Henry remembers it clearly. The flour that arrived from the mill was yellowish, mixed with barley and rye. Customers complained of stomach aches. Claudine had to calm mothers who said the bread gave their children rashes. Henry made substitution loaves cut with potato starch, chestnut flour, and sometimes boiled beans, mashed and dried into powder. The loaves were smaller, denser, and kept poorly, but they were still bread. He offered them at a lower price or on credit. Some were bartered for eggs, candles, or firewood. Henry kept a list under the counter of families who owed him. Some debts would never be paid, but he never stopped making the bread. Because in times of hardship, a baker did not simply sell, he fed. The bread police. In larger towns, particularly in provincial cities like Lyon or Avignon, the garde des poids et measures, the weights and measures inspector, was a feared figure among bakers. Arriving unannounced, he would weigh loaves from the counter, measure diameter and height, inspect ledgers, interview customers, asking if prices had changed or weights were short. Bakers found cheating could be fined, closed, or even jailed, especially if suspicion of price gouging arose during shortages. Henry once visited a cousin in Nimes who had his bakery shut down for 2 weeks after a customer reported being shorted 50 grams on her loaf. The cousin swore it was the oven's fault, that the humidity had shrunk the crust. It didn't matter. The social role of bread. Bread was not simply eaten, it was judged. Its crust, crumb, smell, and shelf life were scrutinized. A good loaf had a crisp, evenly browned crust, a soft, airy interior with irregular holes, a subtle sourness from proper fermentation, a rich aroma, neither too sweet nor acidic. Villagers knew these qualities intimately. They could identify loaves from different bakers by taste alone. Children were taught how to press the belly of the bread to test its spring. Elderly women would tap the crust with their fingernails. A failed loaf was not just a disappointment, it was a personal affront. Henry once had an off batch. His leaven had over-fermented. The bread came out flat and bitter. Customers noticed immediately. That week, half his usual clientele went to a bakery in a nearby village. Claudine tried to soothe him. "One bad bake does not make you a bad baker," she said. But he cleaned the oven twice that night, muttering to himself. He spoke less for days. Because a baker's pride was baked into every boule. Apprenticeship and inheritance. Bread making was not just a trade, it was a legacy. Henry had apprenticed under a baker named Jules for 5 years. He had swept floors, cleaned ash, milled flour by hand, learned the science of dough by observation and mistake. Only after 4 years was he allowed to mix dough unsupervised. Now his sons were learning the same. The older Lucien was already shaping loaves. He had a feel for symmetry and watched the oven like a priest watches an altar. The younger Jean preferred tending the fire. He loved the crackling and claimed he could hear when the heat was ready. Henry did not speak of inheritance, but everyone in the village assumed Lucien would one day be le boulanger. When Henry eventually died, his name might not appear in books or plaques, but the flavor of his bread would linger in memory. It would be tasted in future batches, passed down through hands and instinct. Women and the bread chain. Claudine was more than just the baker's wife. She managed the accounts, maintained relationships with regulars, knew every customer's preferences, debts, and quirks. She also supervised brioche baking on Sundays, a treat made with butter and eggs, sometimes sold for double price to the notary's family. In some villages, when a baker died suddenly, his wife took over. This was not always approved by the commune, but practicality won out. Women bakers were not rare, but they were rarely recognized. Claudine never complained, but she also never burned a batch. An evening quietude. By 7:00 p.m. the bakery is silent, the oven cools, the ash is swept. The wooden tables are wiped down, the flour sacks are folded. Henry sits outside the bakery with a small mug of watered wine. His hands rest on his knees. His fingernails are blackened with soot. His shoulders ache. Children play in the square. A dog licks the last crumbs from a paper wrapper. Someone walks by and nods, clutching a half-eaten boule. Henry nods back. The satisfaction is not loud, It is not pride, it is continuity. Bread was made, bread was eaten. Tomorrow it begins again. In flour there is labor, in yeast there is memory, and in every crust there is a trace of the hands that shaped it. So we ask, when a village no longer smells of bread in the morning, has it lost something more than food? By the late 1800s, the rhythm of rural bread-making in France was slowly, subtly beginning to change. It did not happen all at once. There was no great declaration, no ceremony. But beneath the quiet hum of dough rising and ovens cooling, a transformation was underway. This final section is not about decline or nostalgia. It is about the passing of hands, the slow fade of one generation's method, and the uncertain rise of another. It is about how bread, even in its simplest form, carries the memory of labor, the touch of tradition, and the tension between survival and change. Let us follow the final years of Henry the Baker not in tragedy, but in quiet continuity. A new century approaches. It is 1893. The village is still here, so is the bakery. But the world outside is shifting. Railroads bring city loaves to the countryside. Parisian bakeries now boast shiny mixers and steam ovens. A new kind of bread pain viennois, soft and sweet, arrives in the provincial towns. More and more, young people leave the villages for cities like Lyon and Marseille. Henry has slowed down. His son Lucien now rises at midnight to feed the levain and tend the fire. Henry watches, advises, and corrects, but he no longer needs. Claudine walks with a cane now. Jean, the younger son, has joined the seminary. The bakery remains unchanged in its bones, same stone walls, same wooden counter, same ash-lined oven. But it exists now in a world that values efficiency more than ritual. Lucien is practical. He's considering buying a kneading machine. A traveling salesman brought one through last spring. Claudine was appalled. Henry said nothing. The last baking by hand. One autumn morning, after a heavy rain, Henry decides to make bread again alone. Lucien tries to protest, but Henry is insistent. Just a batch for the saint's day. He lights the fire with dry kindling. He prepares the leaven, smiling as the scent hits his nose. He measures the flour by hand, even though he's taught Lucien to weigh it now. He kneads slowly, resting between folds. He works not from necessity, but from memory. As the loaves rise, Claudine comes downstairs and sits by the oven. They speak little. The heat warms their legs. They listen to the quiet breathing of the dough. When the loaves come out 6 in total, they are imperfect, slightly uneven. One is too dark. But the crust sings when tapped. The smell fills the room. Lucien eats one that night and says nothing, but later carves a small H into the wooden peel, a quiet tribute to the man who taught him the craft. A loaf left behind. The village bakery was, in many ways, a memory machine. It held stories not in books or ledgers, but in muscle, routine, and repetition. Years after Henry passes away, quietly in his sleep, the village still speaks of his bread. Madame Bellamy tells the new baker that his crusts are too thin. Children who are now adults remember the smell of flour on his sleeves. Lucien keeps the old kneading trough, even though he has installed a mechanical one. And in a small clay jar near the back window, he keeps a dried piece of leaven, Henry's last starter. It is not usable, but he cannot throw it away. The changing of crumbs. By the early 20th century, bread-making in France had entered a new era. Urban bakers used steam-injected ovens, giving birth to the modern baguette. Flour became standardized, whiter, more refined. Fermentation times shortened. Bakeries advertised speed and consistency, not soul. Rural bakeries held out as long as they could, but many disappeared, closed, bought out, or abandoned. And yet some survived, because even with all the machinery, bread remained a ritual. At funerals, bread was shared. At baptisms, a sweet loaf might be given. During wars, soldiers wrote home not asking for money or shoes but for bread. And in every village that still had a working boulangerie, the morning queue reminded people that fresh bread meant civilization. Bread in the body. There is an old saying in Provence, pain fait le cœur chaud. Bread warms the heart. But in Henry's world, bread also built the body. It was calories, protein, and survival. A laborer could eat up to a kilogram of bread per day. Children teethed on crusts. Elderly women soaked it in broth when their teeth failed. It was not decoration, it was fuel. When we imagine history, we often picture kings, wars, inventions. But perhaps a more honest image would be this. A boy, his hands dusty with flour, rising before dawn to shape dough in silence because his father did, and his grandfather before him. And that too is history. A quiet legacy. Today, a handful of bakeries still follow the old ways. Hand-mixed leaven, wood-fired ovens, no timers, no mixers, no steam injectors. They are rarities. But when you bite into such a loaf dark, irregular, imperfect, you are tasting a memory. Not of Henry specifically, but of someone like him. Someone who knew the feel of proper fermentation without ever using a thermometer. Someone who could tell the weather by how long the dough took to rise. Someone who believed that even if nothing else was right in the world, the bread must still be good. Final reflection. In the end, a loaf of bread lasts only a day, maybe two. It is eaten, crumbs fall, the crust softens, it disappears. And yet across centuries, across generations, the practice endures. The oven is cleaned, the flour is measured, the fire is lit. And someone waits quietly for the first warm loaf of morning. So we end with a simple question. If bread is temporary, but the making of it never ends, what then have we really inherited? It is often said that revolutions are made in streets or on battlefields. But more often than not, they happen at workbenches, places of repetition, heat, and unbearable noise. This is the story of a button factory in Manchester, England, in the year 1884, a place where thousands of buttons a day were stamped, polished, drilled, and boxed, a place of monotony and sometimes injury, a place where the Industrial Revolution had already taken root and where human beings and machines lived in uneasy partnership. It is a boring story in many ways, but it is also the story of precision, survival, and the incredible human energy behind even the smallest things like the humble shirt button. The city that clattered. By the late 19th century, Manchester had become known as Cottonopolis, the industrial nerve center of textile production in Britain. But with every finished coat, every factory-sewn blouse, every military uniform, came the need for one crucial component. Buttons. Buttons were not just accessories. They were fasteners, status symbols, military insignia, and often the only ornamentation on otherwise plain clothing. By 1880, it was estimated that over 300 million buttons were produced in Britain each year. The majority came from Birmingham, but Manchester's proximity to textile mills made it a vital location for finishing and sorting. Our story unfolds in a 3-story brick building just off the River Irk, one of many small factories dotting the city's smog-hung horizon. It has no name outside, just a number, 67B. Inside, over 40 workers, most of them women and children, a long, narrow floor, and endless trays of buttons. The workers, faces without names. You arrive just after dawn. The gas lamps still burn. There is a smell of oil, coal dust, metal shavings, and stale sweat. The first workers arrive around 5:30 a.m. They are not greeted with pleasantries, only the hiss of steam and the rhythmic thud of stamping machines. Here is Nora, age 16. She has worked here since she was 11. She is quick, with fine fingers, and is considered one of the best at thread inspection, a task that involves checking every fifth button for rough edges or mold defects. Next to her is Mrs. Latch, a widow in her 50s with cracked hands and poor eyesight. She polishes brass military buttons with a small felt wheel. The polishing compound turns her fingernails black. In the corner, boys as young as 10 feed raw blanks into a punching press that carves buttonholes. They are supervised by Mr. Hanley, a foreman who chews tobacco and keeps time with a pocket watch. No one speaks much above a whisper. The machines are too loud. Materials and machines. Buttons at this time could be made from bone, usually from cattle or sheep; brass, for military or official uniforms; mother of pearl, carved from oyster shells; wood, for peasant coats or working trousers; horn, pressed and polished; celluloid, the first plastic, brittle and flammable. In this factory, the majority are bone and horn, sourced cheaply from slaughterhouses and processing plants. These materials arrive in large sacks, dull, rough, and unformed. Machines transform them. Stamping presses cut circular blanks. Drill wheels bore 2 or 4 holes. Polishing drums, large wooden barrels, filled with sand, tumble the buttons for hours. Inspection benches sort by size and quality. Packing tables wrap buttons in thread cards, to be sold in haberdasheries. Each worker has a quota, 500 buttons per hour or more. Mistakes cost time. Time costs wages. There are no bathroom breaks, only a pail behind a curtain in the back. Risk and repetition. The machines do not stop. And so sometimes, neither do the injuries. Nora has a small scar where a drill caught the edge of her palm. One boy lost the tip of a finger in the punching press. Workers frequently inhale bone dust, causing persistent coughs and, in some cases, grinder's lung. No one wears gloves. Gloves slow you down. There are no guards on machines, too expensive. There are no unions, not yet. But there are tricks. Dampen your fingers to better grip the blanks. Don't look away when feeding the drill press. Wear thick linen sleeves to protect from splinters. Everyone knows someone who got buttoned out, that is, dismissed after an injury, unable to meet quotas and therefore replaced. The sound of progress. The floor shakes gently from the press in the basement. It runs on a Beltan pulley steam system connected to a boiler outside. The noise is never-ending. Chunk, chunk, chunk from the hole puncher. SCRAPE from the polishing wheels. Tink, tink, tink as buttons fall into metal trays. Your ears ring by midday. Outside, the clatter of cart wheels on cobblestone. Inside, the smell of boiling bone from the press room makes your stomach turn. Still, the workers do not stop. They eat a cold lunch from tins. Bread, cheese, tea with more milk than leaves. They laugh quietly sometimes. Nora hums a tune. Mrs. Latch tells a story about a boy who tried to escape to Liverpool and ended up back in the same factory by week's end. Everyone finishes the day with dust in their lungs and blisters on their thumbs. Pay and prejudice. Wages vary. Boys earn 5 shillings a week. Women earn 3 to 4. Skilled men in the machine room can earn up to 8. The money is not enough, but it is better than nothing. And for many families, the small coins brought home by a daughter or wife are the difference between food and firewood. There are no pensions, no sick leave, no retirement. You work until your hands give out, and then hope someone will take you in. There is resentment, too, against Irish immigrants accused of driving down wages, against factory owners who take holidays in seaside towns, against government inspectors who arrive only when warned ahead of time. But no one speaks too loudly, because the machines are always listening. Even the smallest things, buttons, in this case, carry the fingerprints of hundreds of unseen lives. And so, as Nora places her last inspected batch into a cloth-lined tray, one wonders, how many forgotten hands lie behind the buttons we no longer see? By now, the button factory has become a world unto itself. It has its own rhythm, fast, mechanical, indifferent. It has its own hierarchy, its own codes of conduct, and its own kind of silence. To the outsider, it may look like a place of dull, repetitive labor. But for those inside, every click of the press, every tray of blanks, is part of a strange, exhausting choreography, a kind of industrial ballet performed by the forgotten poor. As the year progresses, small changes appear, some subtle, others not. Let's return to 67 B, still dusty, still loud. But now, the factory is beginning to feel the pressures of modernization. And with that pressure comes new tension, between workers and managers, between tradition and efficiency, and between the will to endure and the cost of obedience. The foreman's rule. Mr. Hanley, the factory's foreman, is not a cruel man, but he is not kind either. He was a machinist once, promoted for speed and precision. Now he walks the aisles in a thick apron, holding a clipboard, and watches like a hawk. He marks missed quotas in red pencil. If your numbers drop too often, he will move you to polishing a dirtier, lower-paid job. He has no time for complaints. The bone dust gives me a sore throat. Irrelevant. My wrist is sore from the drill. You can use your other hand. It's too hot to work. Then you can leave. Still, some say he's fair. He intervenes when boys are bullied. He doesn't tolerate drinking. And when a machine jams, he fixes it himself without shouting. But he watches everything, especially the young women, especially Nora. Women on the line. The majority of workers on the top floor are young women between the ages of 14 and 25. They are fast, patient, and, according to Hanley, more accurate than the boys. The company likes this. More production, fewer mistakes. They sit in pairs, elbows nearly touching, and sort buttons by size: small, medium, large. Material: horn, bone, celluloid. Quality: flawless, flawed, discard. Their fingers move constantly. Most develop calluses by age 16. Some begin to wear thin strips of cloth between their fingers to avoid friction burns. They talk quietly when Hanley is not around. Nora tells riddles. Lisa, her seatmate, reads cheap romance serials aloud during lunch. One girl, Mary, draws faces on discarded buttons with charcoal stubs. Her little brother collects them like coins. There is no room for dreams here, but there is still personality, stitched into even the smallest act of rebellion. Factory discipline. Every worker must abide by the following rules, posted on the wall near the entry. No lateness beyond 5 minutes. No speaking to neighbors during machine operation. No leaving without supervisor permission. No tampering with machine speed. All quotas must be met, or deductions will apply. Violation of any rule results in a wage dock, often totaling a day's worth of bread. One morning, a girl is caught sneaking a look at a postcard under the table. Mr. Hanley doesn't shout. He just marks her card and moves on. Her name disappears from the books the following week. The lunchroom, if you could call it that. At noon, the machines slow but do not stop. The basement boiler needs constant feeding, so it clanks and breathes even during breaks. Workers gather near the back of the third floor. There are no tables, only upturned crates and low stools. Everyone eats from metal tins, lined with scraps of paper. A typical meal might be cold bread and dripping, pickled onions, cheese rind, sweet tea, heavy with milk if lucky. Someone always shares. Someone always forgets lunch and is too proud to ask. The girls sometimes trade buttons they've pocketed, illicit, but common for hair ribbons or boot polish. A few boys nap in corners. One girl reads her sister's labor journal aloud quietly, with wide eyes. It speaks of minimum wages, female representation, and something called a cooperative workshop. Most workers scoff, a dream surely, but the words linger. The button board. In the office hangs a sample board, a wooden frame covered in felt, where the factory's best buttons are pinned. There are polished brass military fasteners with tiny lions, bone toggles for sailors' coats, delicate mother-of-pearl for evening gloves, even horn buttons dyed to mimic tortoiseshell. Nora sometimes stares at it while sweeping up after shift. They are beautiful, each one drilled, smoothed, and finished by hands like hers, but her name is nowhere to be seen. The buttons will go to tailors in London, or to Paris, or perhaps to a shop window in some rich district she'll never enter. She's proud and angry and tired all at once. Rumors of change. One day in November, a man in a bowler hat arrives. He speaks with the owner. He walks the factory floor with a notebook. He inspects the stamping press, nods at Hanley, and frowns at the dusty walls. Rumors spread quickly. He's from the ministry. They're selling to a larger firm. They're closing the factory by spring. They'll fire the women first. They're bringing in electric drills. Nora doesn't speculate, she just watches. At the end of the week, 2 machines are removed. A new sorting table arrives, sleek, metal, and labeled in French. It can grade buttons by diameter without human touch. Progress, they call it. But what happens to the girl whose fingers did that task yesterday? The button as a symbol. To the world outside, a button is just a small, functional object. But here it is everything. It determines wages. It marks time. It teaches patience. It carries risk. It feeds families. And when packed into neat little paper bundles, wrapped in twine and placed in crates, it represents thousands of small decisions, each one made by a tired worker in a brick building in Manchester. When Lisa drops a tray of finished horn buttons one afternoon, they scatter across the floor like coins. The sound echoes like glass. Hanley sighs but says nothing. Nora helps her pick them up, one by one, carefully, reverently. They do not yet know that their world is nearing its end, but perhaps they can sense it. The question they do not dare to ask: what becomes of the fingers when the buttons no longer need them? By the winter of 1885, the factory at 67B Back Irk Lane had changed more in a few months than it had in the previous decade. The machines now gleamed, powered by a new electric motor. A second-hand automatic grading table, purchased from a French firm, sat where 2 inspection benches had been. But it wasn't just the machines. It was the air. The silence between button drops, the resignation in each measured movement, the whispered worries over tin lunches, the quiet calculations of how many weeks remained before something else did their job faster, quieter, without pause. In this final section, we trace the slow disassembly of a workplace, the unraveling of small routines, and the weight of disappearing labor all over something as small, ordinary, and overlooked as the button. The new manager. In January, Mr. Hanley is replaced. He is too old, they say, too manual, too slow to adapt. No notice, no pension. One morning he simply doesn't return, and in his place is a young man with polished shoes, a university degree, and no factory dust under his nails. His name is Mr. Dawson, and he brings a new tone. We will modernize. We will compete with continental suppliers. We will remove inefficiencies. He smiles too much. He calls the workers team. He implements a time-sheet system where every tray of buttons is logged and signed off. He increases the daily quota by 100 units. He introduces double shifts for men and suggests that domestic arrangements may prevent women from keeping up. Several older women are let go. No one knows where Hanley went. Some say he took a job in a tannery. Others say he left Manchester altogether. Nora's last month. Nora continues to work. She is accurate, quiet, and faster than most. But she feels the pressure mounting. Her friend Lisa is dismissed after arriving late 2 days in a row. No appeal, no explanation, just a brief nod from Dawson and a line drawn through her name in the ledger. The benches are emptier now, fewer jokes, fewer lunches shared, fewer charcoal faces drawn on defective buttons. At night, Nora walks home past factories with boards on the windows. Some have been turned into warehouses, others simply abandoned. She counts her wages carefully. She's saving for a sewing machine. She wants to leave factory work, perhaps do mending or alterations from home. But her fingers ache, her back is stiff, the thread dust seems harder to wash out of her hair. Buttons for Empire. Ironically, business is booming. The factory receives a large military contract, thousands of uniform buttons for the British expedition in Sudan. Brass buttons bearing the royal insignia, each one polished to gleam like gold. It should be good news. But with it comes more machines, fewer hands, and greater speed. 3 more workers are dismissed in 1 week. The new machines can drill 1,200 buttons an hour, compared to the average human rate of 400. They never rest, never break for tea, never complain of splinters or headaches. Progress, at least on paper. The last accident. In early March, a boy named Alfie, age 12, gets his sleeve caught in the brass press. It happens in seconds. His arm is broken in 2 places, blood on the floor, panic, silence. Dawson files a report, says the boy was reckless. His family receives £1 in compensation. No changes are made to the machine. The others return to work before the blood dries fully. Nora scrubs the floor with vinegar. The smell lingers for days. Afterward, she stops speaking at work entirely. Closure in all but name. In April, a notice goes up. Effective immediately, all polishing and sorting will be mechanized. Workers affected may apply for reassignment. Only 3 positions are open. 21 workers apply. Most do not bother. Mrs. Latch is let go after 27 years. She leaves with no farewell, just a wrapped cloth bundle and a stiff walk down the stairs. The benches sit empty, trays collect dust, even the machines seem to hum with a colder rhythm. And then one Friday evening, Nora does not return. No letter, no explanation. She simply disappears from the books. And yet, the factory doesn't close, not officially. It continues for another decade, producing buttons by machine. The noise changes, the faces change, the materials change. Eventually, even this factory is outpaced by cheaper overseas suppliers. By 1912, 67B is converted into a textile dye warehouse. The machines are sold for scrap. But one polishing stone remains, a felt wheel, left behind in a corner darkened with use. When the warehouse floods in the 1930s, it is found again, floating in a shallow pool of oily rainwater. Still it spins. The button in history. Buttons are still made, of course. Plastic, metal, wood, resin, cheap, efficient, automated. But rarely someone finds an old bone button, smoothed by hand, imperfect in size. A flea market, an attic box, a sewing kit from a great-grandmother. And they hold it for a moment. It is just a circle, but it carries the weight of history. A pressed thumb. A cough from bone dust. A quota unmet. A day without lunch. A girl named Nora. In that quiet, unremarkable button is 100 hours of forgotten life. Final reflection. Factories do not remember their workers. Machines do not mourn the hands that fed them. But objects do. Buttons especially hold stories, not of kings or generals, but of girls who inspected them by candlelight, boys who polished them for bread, and men who replaced them with gears and steel.